February 24th, 2017. This is a video about living fences, brush walls, deer deflection, habitat creation, and stacking function in clearing shrub and tree layers for future production and putting those elements, that huge amount of biomass, to use. So stick with us and we'll talk about living fences and woven walls. So here we are. This is the western bound of edible acres. And you can see to the north and to the east of me, I do a whole series on this, you can look into it, on clearing areas for future orchard production. This was all shrub layer: European buckthorn, graybark dogwood, Japanese honeysuckle, rose, and some trees that I cleared over the last 5 years using a chainsaw and mainly hand tools. And what was viable for firewood or posts was turned into that. What was tops was either turned into biochar when the season is right, or very laboriously but very worthwhile, dragged all the way to the edges of the property, so just inside the property line, but bounding the 6 acres that we have here. I'll try to take a shot of it. The eastern end of edible acres is open, and that's because that's where the road is, that's where people come and go. But the west, north, and south edges of the property all have a similar treatment to what you're seeing here. And the idea was going through along that property line, identifying trees and shrubs and vines that potentially make fruit or nuts or food or medicine, and promoting them. So here's a hawthorn that of course was left. Now I can of course also pollard that and work in pear scion wood to grow different types of fruit. Just so I'm going to use this term a bit, coppicing and pollarding. Coppicing is where you cut something near ground level when it's dormant so that it can sprout new shoots. Pollarding is cutting above browse level of animals so that it will sprout and send shoots. And you see that treatment all throughout. So for example, this living stem here is a hawthorn that was pollarded, and those new shoots can be cleft graft over to pears. So that's kind of a nice treatment to go through as a first pass, what's usable in here, and promoting that. There's a fair bit of hawthorn, apple, serviceberry, wild cherry that's common for hedgerows, and so I'm making sure as I clear that I'm looking for those and keeping them as my overstory. The tops and slash and debris over years have been packed in. You can imagine how much organic matter is in there, how much habitat for rabbits, birds, mice, voles, the like, which is fine by me. They deserve a home. And part of what this is doing is creating a deflection for deer. I would be disingenuous and pretty much non-observant if I could say over 6 acres that I've created a system that completely excludes deers. Yes, deers, I said. That exclude deer. And so what I've done is periodically left open apertures, knowing that they're going to come and go. But then for hunting purposes, I know where to set up shop if I want to harvest venison. And you can see the deer psychologically use these apertures pretty heavily because it's the path of least resistance. And as long as I'm not applying constant pressure, they get into the habit of coming and going through, let's say, 5 or 6 places instead of diffusely everywhere. And by pollarding some of these shrubs, so for example, there's a buckthorn that's been now pollarded twice, I have these rigid poles behind which I can pack slash and debris. In front of these, so in other words, on our side, the inside of this brush wall, I'm now beginning, now that the clearing has taken place, I'm beginning to plant in the living wall that will eventually create the more permanent infrastructure. And the pattern that I'm doing on this western end, we'll take a look and see some of them, is basically this waterway allows water in from our neighbors and shunts it this way, partially because they spray. It's an apple orchard. I don't want that water entering directly into the landscape. But as I excavated that soil with a shovel, I deposited it upslope and made a planting berm, and I've added in all sorts of layers. We've got herbaceous layers, so there's elecampane, there's Jerusalem artichokes, there's horseradish, there's comfrey. All of that is dormant right now. And then I've also started to, let's see if I can find some examples in here. It's pretty small. In the summer it's a lot more interesting. But I've added in the future tree layers. So there are swamp white oaks. It's a wet spot in here. There's serviceberry. There is elderberry. Currants have been stuck. Black locust, redbud. And so here's another oak, I believe. There's a sea buckthorn tucked in there, right in the hedgerow. That spiky, nitrogen-fixing being will be able to start spreading out, and I can manage that as a living part of the fence. And so we have this dead fence that is blocking wind, catching spray, providing habitat, deflecting deer, also providing the nucleus of organic matter decomposition to fuel the designed future. Black locust, woven and pollarded, will make an incredible fence in 5 years or 10 years. That black locust right next to a serviceberry. You can hear the birds in there yelling at me. They're probably getting ready to make babies in here. There's giant miscanthus grasses which can grow and fill out. I've also added vining layers like hops, air potato, groundnut, grapes, and the like to start really filling out. Every 4 feet from this point southbound is a blue false indigo bush, which is a nitrogen-fixing, deer deflecting. It's pretty poisonous or toxic to deer, and makes beautiful nectar for bees. So that's every 4 feet. There's about 150 of those planted, and those will be woven together to create a deer deflecting, nitrogen fixing, trellis for growing, vining crop fence that is not edible, which is fine by me because it's doing other ecosystem service. So there'll be all sorts of layers that can grow up on this. Back in here you see more miscanthus grasses, elderberry. So that's being packed as time allows with more and more elements to fill into a living thing that can be pollarded, woven, managed, etc. over time. Let's look at some other areas. Here we are near the southwest corner of the property. The pin is just in that hedgerow. We're lucky enough to have a big old apple, big old pear, another apple, all in the hedgerow. So we're designing around that, packing the brush wall on our side of the property line, but not by much. And this area is a little bit further along in succession. You can see that bamboo is starting to get more established. It's been here for a few years. There's a cutting of a hybrid poplar that I just pollarded again to get more cuttings to propagate, and that's establishing a nice wet-loving tree layer element, that poplar and this willow, which was also pollarded. And originally, 5 years ago, I stuck those into the muck of the dead furrow where this used to be plowed way back when this was an open field. Also in here we've got Osage orange, boom, bada boom. Now, these are all going to be big, big trees, spiky, healthy, habitat-forming, deer-holding back trees. They're planted so close, but the plan is to manage them to continue making slash to pack right into the wall. A little further in from that same wall, closer to us, the food layers going in. Hazelnut, looks like a chestnut, and a persimmon. 3 feet between them. Lots of opportunity to let nature select which one will be the overstory, but a design with the idea that hazelnut is a shrub layer, chestnut is a tree layer. This is to the south of the chestnut, so they should be compatible with light access into the future. Persimmon is shade tolerant, so the chestnut casting shade should be compatible with the persimmon, and it will be allowed to fill out into this area with the Osage oranges being slashed and packed as spiky bits into the wall. So it's chaotic, but it has thought behind it. As we move eastbound on the southern wall, you can see a hawthorn that was pollarded last year with the branches cut and remaining connected so that all of those can send up shoots. It's It's more of a traditional hedge laying technique. Those little shoots can be grafted over to different varieties of pears. More miscanthus grass to collect light and turn it into biomass and all that. Those can be chop and dropped, used for mulch, etc. Autumn olive as a nitrogen fixing shrub element in here. Hazelnuts all throughout. Everywhere you see a locust spike, there's generally a hazelnut. There's a bunch on this side of the path as well. Maybe 200 to 300 hazelnuts on this property. The apple was here, so I cleared around it and promoted it. And then in the space that was created around it, I planted shade-tolerant grafted persimmon. Now, because this is a grafted persimmon, it's a higher value. I took the time to put some fence and mulch around it. And down this whole line, you see the brush wall to the right. In other words, the southern edge of the property. And I really don't see deer in this area very much because it is so hard for them to just leave. Psychologically, it's not that compelling to browse and hang in here. But you can see more. There's mulberry. There's another grafted persimmon. Here's a pear that I planted a few years ago, doing nicely. That's old enough and strong enough I can start putting compost at the bottom and growing cucumbers, peas, beans, and the like, using the pear as a trellis. More persimmon, and then a nice hedgerow of hazelnuts, getting ready to put on a great crop this year. It's a lot of catkins. And they're packed in. Again, they're on 3-foot, sometimes 2-foot centers. I can always select out ones that are unproductive or make too small of a nut or have other issues. And the more chaotic it is, the harder it is for browsing to be devastating. Imagine a deer being able to eat every last stem in there. It's just not a possibility anymore. It's too thick, it's too wild. So designing that wild pattern in makes it a little hard to manage, but I'm not trying to run a tractor through or mow in there. I'm just letting it evolve into a chaos of oily protein in shells. More brush wall. We're promoting the wild blackcaps that are near the brush wall, and eventually they can be woven in and incorporated into that. So more tangling, rooting, spiky that happens to make fruit. And then again, here's an apple that was in the hedgerow amongst all the other chaos. Now it's released. It can grow into old age. Drops tons of beautiful, nice-sized red apples in the fall. No spray, no management, no real tending, just a yield. And tons of rabbits living in this hedgerow. Every apple that drops, if I don't get it, is eaten and the manure deposited in this now open glade. There's comfrey and ferns around the apple, but the rest of this area is being fertilized by those rabbits and wildlife that eat the apples. This is a viable space to develop a garden now, as long as it's somewhat shade tolerant of being under an apple tree. More of the southern hedgerow on the right, big apple in the background, and then a boundary planting of giant miscanthus grass and some bamboos to be a little bit more of a windbreak from the cold winter winds that push up from the south, and then also a really nice hedge and a source of carbon and mulch for my production beds that are more into the property here. And this again was all shrub layer and trees and chaos that was either woven into the fence, turned into firewood, or made into biochar. And now we've got permanent raised production beds. We grew potatoes in these at first, used the potatoes and the hilling throughout the year to eradicate the weeds, then planted to garlic. Now it's in kale, and this year we can translate all of these beds into full production nursery or annual crop production. They're weed-free and fertile and ready to go. I mentioned hawthorn as being a potential understock or rootstock for pear. Here you can see a hawthorn on the bottom that was pollarded a few years ago and then top worked over to a pear. That's growing okay. And then one right behind it, same treatment. Hawthorn in the middle, you can see the swelling point where they calloused, and now it's a pear. So everywhere I see a hawthorn, I either see spiky, deer-deflecting, high biomass, high BTU firewood resource, pollen source for bees, and I also see pears in my future. Great example of focusing deer activity. I wonder if deer come through here. And since I know deer are coming and going through here, I know to design for deer repellent or just deer non-impacted crops. I could imagine this whole area moving over to black currants. There's already blackcap raspberries. They do not mess with those. So I can bring in cultivar blackcaps, do yastaberry. I don't see red currant being browsed very much. That's a lot of minor fruit in an area where I know there are deer and not having to worry about it much. I will not plant a grafted apple right there. So nature's showing me, a more distinct planting strategy by working with it and observing what's happening. Again, in overstory, you see a serviceberry here on the right and a nice apple further down. Probably 40 to 50 wild apples in the hedgerows to be released when we first moved here. Further east on the southern end, now we're getting closer to the Zone 1 area, Zone 2 area, where I do most of my intensive work. And there you can see the home in the background. But the wall continues here. There's a trench dug that's bringing water down. I did a whole video where I talked about this pond system, and so I'll link to that here. And that's what's happening on the inside again. And you can sense again where the property line is pretty easily. And in here I've planted an autumn olive to fix nitrogen, provide nectar, a place for birds to land from the hedgerow as they come in to do their work and browse. Also, of course, a medicinal crop for us. Nitrogen fixing in an area where water is flowing through, so it's fertilizing the water that goes into those ponds. And since this is such a wet area, I've also planted aronia every 15 feet or so. There's another one over there with some blackcaps planted near it so that they can be woven through the aronia to protect it. It's all dormant now, but pretty much across this entire brush wall on the inside is comfrey every 6 inches to a foot, which I can chop and drop into the waterways, harvest for our chickens, build biomass with, or whatever I need. And they really enjoy all that excess nutrient that's being leached out. So you can get the sense this area is being developed a little bit more intensely than some of the earlier areas we talked about. There's sea buckthorn, there's black currants. There are things that for the most part deer don't go for, but it's a high enough value area that where the brush wall has been woven, which you can see in front and now on the right, additional layer of protection is not that bad an idea. So I pounded in locust stakes and ran 14 gauge wire, maybe 18 inches and 3 feet. That's all now trellis to grow crops on. There's another aronia that can get woven and espaliered through this. Pretty low tech. Here's a way to say no to deer coming through, which is just a ball of old fencing. They used to walk through here, now they don't. Another nice sized aronia right in front of me. And again, that combination of a woven wall, a pollarded living wall, brush wall, and then a little bit of fencing makes for this area being a higher reliability that deer won't come in here at all. Looks like a wild tiger was able to get in through the brush wall, so I need to tighten it up on this side. Are you a wild tiger? Oh yeah. So that's the idea. The concept being I've got a lot of shrub and tree land to clear, but I don't want to just burn it all up and get rid of all that carbon. It's a great way to create habitat, make a windbreak, make a snow catch, make deer deflection, create all this beautiful space for things to happen and a nucleus for organic matter to happen and locations for future plantings to get the fuel they need. I've really got to protect from this wild tiger.